Hey there, folks. This is Jay Frost speaking to you from, of course, the Philanthropy Mastermind series. Happy to have you back and glad that you're here because you're probably in the thick of getting things ready for, of course, the rest of the giving season. And so I'm glad that you are here to look into the future and beyond what's right in front of us, especially in the wake of Giving Tuesday yesterday. In fact, I should just ask everybody before we begin how your Giving Tuesday was. If you participated in it, if it was successful for you, if you're looking for things to do with the folks who maybe joined you for the first time, all these things are important to know and hear about. So if you want to say any of that or anything else, I hope you'll use the chat throughout today in order to be a part of the conversation, but also just to tell us how you're feeling. And the numbers were a little bit down this year, and that mirrors some of what we saw in terms of the big Giving USA results. But when you consider where the economy is in terms of inflation, actually, the numbers look pretty good. It's all a matter of perspective and also what we've been doing to engender interest. So let us know what you're thinking and feeling throughout today. And also that informs what we're going to program next year, because we're going to have a big, big year as we look into the future, which is the point of today's session. But before I introduce that, not only do I want to welcome you, but I also want to thank our sponsor of this entire series, which is DonorSearch. And we won't be talking about them today unless our guest chooses to mention them for some reason, but that doesn't mean we don't care about them. We do deeply. If it weren't for DonorSearch, we couldn't have had now I think it's over 500 plus discussions with leaders in the field, like we're going to have today with Trista Harris, on philanthropy and fundraising, going back to 2016. And you can learn all about that and see all these sessions over on the DonorSearch website at donorsearch.net. Under the resources tab. And while you're there, check out, of course, about your own donors, because I'd like to think that you're focused on them right now as we're getting ready for the big, heavy season of giving. Now, of course, what we're going to talk about today is the future. I keep saying the future, but I'm not really talking about what I mean, because I've got the ultimate futurist here to talk about it, who is none other than Trista Harris, the author of this little book, among others, which I keep on my shelf, and I hope you will too. FutureGood, also the name of her firm. Trista, thanks so much for hanging out today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me here today.
It's great to have you. And I know you're a busy person. For people who don't know your work, you've been at it for a long time. I mean, dating back to the days you were a kid. But
Yeah.
in the professional realm here, I guess it goes back to your work with the foundations right there in your neck of the woods, the Minnesota Council on Foundations,
Yep.
which you headed, of course, as the president there, and then also serving as the Headwaters Foundation for Justice organization, working as the executive director there, and other things. But you've been talking to people throughout the sector, kind of getting them primed for not just what's right in front of their face, but what they need to be doing for a long, long time. And first of all, this book came out when? When did you have FutureGood come out?
2018.
2018. Okay, so it's been a little bit, but the reality is that this is as much I guess at least for me, a way to think about things that are going to happen as they are about reading a book about predicting what had.
Yeah,
what was the inspiration for this? I never asked you that before.
Yeah, for sure. So I just felt like the pace of change was getting so much faster in the sector. And I've been doing futurism work since 2008 when I was running the Headwaters Foundation. I was a couple months into the job. Stock market collapsed. Our endowment lost about half of its value. And I ran into a book about futurism. And as I was reading it, the book was How to Get a Business Advantage During Times of Crisis. And I was like, this is a time of crisis. Please tell me what to do. And we started bringing those tools to our grantees. And in the following few years, I had 10 legislative wins, the most in our organization's history. And it really lit this spark in me that futurism tools could help people make the world a better place. And so I started using the tools and did a lot of speaking around the country and some consulting work with foundations and nonprofits. But it felt like the pace of change was getting so much faster that it couldn't just be me bouncing all over the country. What we needed is an entire sector that understood how to both predict and shape the future. And so the purpose of the FutureGood book is to teach other people how to use futurism in their work.
And maybe before we jump into whether or not they've actually done that, or if the change is just happening with or without intentionality for many, I'd love to go back to 2008 for a second.
Yes.
There are people in this room with us and watching this later who don't have a memory of that.
Oof, lucky you.
So first of all, let's give us a frame of reference. What was
Yeah.
that like? Because we could have had that happen again recently. We've had challenges during COVID, serious economic challenges, many challenges. But
Sure.
what was it like then when you started this? And what were those legislative accomplishments?
Yeah.
That's important too.
Yeah, for sure. So I think for me being a new executive director of a foundation, and it was a community foundation, so we have to fundraise to have our dollars to do the work, to start at a time kind of like now where people are worried about what's going to happen with the economy and they're being cautious. That is not a great place to be as the lead fundraiser for your organization. And I remember there was a morning where our investment advisor called and he said, "Don't panic," which is a perfect time to panic. And that was the 50% drop in the endowment. And we had tried to be a good grant maker that did multi-year grant making, and suddenly we had no dollars left to give. And that is not a great place to be as a community foundation, especially with grantees doing economic justice work, racial justice work. They needed our support more than ever. And suddenly we didn't have resources to give. And so when I found this book, we started bringing these tools to our grantees. And honestly, the conversation with them is, many of you might not exist at the end of this financial crisis. How do we ensure that the work that you're doing continues? And what is the picture of what success looks like after this challenging time? So at that point, being based in Minnesota, what do you want Minnesota to look like at the end of this for the communities that you care about? So our grantees came together and developed these shared pictures of the future that were really beautiful and started to work together instead of constantly competing to be able to create that change. And the wins that they had were things on alternative teacher certification to make sure that our teaching force was more diverse. First in its country, homeowners' bill of rights to deal with the mortgage foreclosure crisis, which had caused that economic downturn. A lot of folks were being evicted from their homes and losing their homes. And we wanted to make sure that their homeowners had rights in this process. We also moved forward marriage equity in the state of Minnesota, and we also stopped a voter ID bill during that time. And all of that came from a shared picture of what we wanted the state to look like, as opposed to, we don't want these bad things to happen. You have to have a picture of what success looks like as well.
There's so much to unpack even in that as a history lesson, because people always talk about, the swinging of the political tides. And I don't know. I mean, when you talked about the efforts for racial justice right then and there, and all those other things, what struck me is in 2008, that was something that you were focused on, and clearly there were others, but it was not the general conversation in America. I mean, it wasn't the thing that you might get if you were watching, take your pick, CNN or whoever every night. So there was maybe an opportunity. And it must have made it both more challenging, but also in some ways, kind of an open discussion about what these things meant, defining the terms and taking some action. Did you have pushback against any of those actions later, as we saw, some of the kind of pushback more generally in society?
Yeah, I think there's always pushback, and Headwaters at that point had been doing the work for 25 years and had a racial equity frame for most of those 25 years. And a lot of people were not a fan. So the groups that we were working with, small people of color led organizations working on community organizing, often under-resourced. At that point, we were able to give very small grants for their work, but with small grants, they were able to create big change. And I think the interesting piece as we talk about the future is that those grantees were setting the pace for all of the work that we saw happen in 2020, that the groundwork that they had been building over time became much more visible in 2020, but there is a long history of that work over time. And you're able to build on that in moments of crisis and bring new people to the table that hadn't paid attention previously. And then sometimes you hit points in society where people have to pay attention.
Now, you weren't at Headwaters anymore, obviously, in 2020, but do you know if people were then coming to the foundation and other kind of sister, like-minded organizations to look for a model?
Yes.
The thing that we were all encountering?
Yeah, for sure. Headwaters has grown a ton in that time, and they were the partner that many traditional foundations were reaching out to say, how do we do this? They were also the model for There are new efforts that are happening to support especially Black-led organizations in Minnesota. And that idea of community-led grant making, which Headwaters has really pioneered in Minnesota, has been replicated in lots of different ways. So yeah, I think when you're on the cutting edge, it is sure lonely in the beginning. And then when folks sort of notice that need, you can't be the I told you so partner. You have to be the let me tell you what we've learned in this process, and we'll help you get there as well.
Yeah, help bring people, bring them along. There's been another conversation, last thing about the past before we get into the present and future. There's also been a discussion a lot in the last few years about how essentially foundations should spend out. Whether it's the argument about DAFs, which is very hot in DC right now, or more generally with the more traditional foundations of every shape and size. So even when they're doing great work, like the work you were just describing, has there been pressure either then or now for organizations even doing good work to just, turn that money back into the community?
Yeah, to get off your assets is the push that I often hear. Yeah, I think it's important to have those conversations. And we work with a lot of foundations. And the question is, what is the purpose of the foundation and the work? If it is about transformative change, there are times like 2020 where you need to make huge investments. And we saw many foundations increase their grant making. We saw folks that did loans against endowments to make much larger gifts and a low interest rate moment that existed at that point in time that does not exist now. But really it was an opportunity to say the purpose of foundations is not to exist in perpetuity. The purpose of foundations is to create transformation and change. Sometimes that transformation and change is about being there in the long haul and always being that committed partner. Sometimes it is about making significant investments at times where it's really needed to be able to solve the problems that you're working on instead of making them 5% less terrible. So how do we move to the place where both foundations and nonprofits are actually solving the problems that they're working on so that they can move on to another problem?
So when it comes to this discussion about the future, I felt a little bit like Disney when I said that. There's a thing at Epcot where they have you go into the future. But that's kind of the silly way of looking at it when this is a framework for decision making. So among other things, but how did you and others develop that framework, and how have you adapted it? As I'm sure you've learned things, but also all your partners across the country have learned new ways of addressing things that you didn't foresee.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of futurism tools that are really helpful. One is sort of thinking about different possibilities and things that could happen. So for many organizations, it isn't that there's a million different possibilities. There's probably 3 or 4 different things that could happen about the issue that you care about or about your organizational structure. That if you could do some thinking about that before that challenge or opportunity presents itself, then you are in much better position when that change happens. So I encourage every nonprofit to have that staff and board conversation. What if somebody gave us $100 million? What if somebody gave us $10 million? What would we do? What would, if we had big dollars to create change, how would we invest that to really solve the problems that we're working on? In that visioning and radical imagination, there's often a path that isn't about $100 million. It's about different activities that you should be doing with your current budget to be able to get to that future that's important to you. The other tool that we use really often in our work is something called backcasting. So many of your viewers and listeners have heard of forecasting, where you look at past conditions and you make an estimate of what's going to happen next and what's going to happen next. There's a lot of that work that happens in futurism. And I think it's helpful because it allows you to see different trends that may impact your work in the future. But what we don't do nearly often enough is backcasting. And I think for nonprofits, we need to have a picture of what complete success looks like. If it was 50 years in the future and you were fully successful in meeting your mission and money wasn't an issue and public policy alignment was not an issue, what would the community that you care about look like? Or what would the world look like? And what would you have to look like in that future for that to be true? What sort of work would you be doing? Who would be around the table? And then you work backwards and you say, in the present, what are we doing that leads us directly to that future? Maybe we've tried it once, maybe we do it all the time, but if we're consistent, it's going to get us to that future that we laid out? And then what are the things that we're doing that actually make it impossible to reach that future? If we keep on going down this path, it's pulling us farther and farther away from the future. And what we find with our clients that we do strategy and visioning work with, we have them develop that 50-year vision, and we have them look at the present, and then they develop a work plan. So what is the things that they need to do in the next 3 years to get them closer to that ideal future? And it's built as a rolling plan. I think many of your listeners will feel like we have a strategy and it sits on a shelf somewhere. It sits on a hard drive. Nobody sees it. And we look back on it and we go, oh, there was a global pandemic. And so we didn't do any of those things because the world changed in a way that we hadn't predicted. I think what a rolling work plan and a rolling strategic plan give you is an opportunity to actually harness that transformation and change that's happening in the world, and you adapt your strategy to continue to get you closer to that point on the horizon. And I think for many organizations in 2020, what I saw them say is, our strategy no longer works. So we've laid out a strategic plan. The whole world is different, and so we have to completely scrap it. Or they haven't been able to do more than just react. So you're sort of waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Mm-hmm. And our responsibility in the sector is to have a picture of the future that we're creating. And when those bad or good things happen in the world, what is it about that can help us get closer to that future that we've laid out? And that means that it doesn't take 50 years to get to that ideal future. It usually takes about 5 to 7 years for organizations to make that future happen, but you needed a long enough runway to imagine something completely different than what you're doing in the present.
You know, as you're talking about this, it strikes me that, let's imagine you're working with an organization trying to help them do a bit of backcasting and future casting.
Yeah.
But there are probably some impediments, psychological impediments people have for any kind of change.
For sure.
But one of them is always just personal. I mean, it might be just, you know, if I do things a different way, or if I first of all, I'm not sure I have the competency to do it, or that I'll get the support I need at home or at work, or I'm not paid to do that, or there are all these things, or just fear. If I do it and I don't do it well, I'll be fired. I mean, there are all these things that people think about. And I'm wondering, as you've worked through this with people, if maybe for a second you could talk about the application for us as individuals, because the individuals together are the ones who decide, we're going to step forward.
100%. There's such fear about change. And I think that is the challenge with most strategy processes, is we say, I can do a little bit more of what I've been doing. So just sort of pushing along those edges, but nothing different, nothing new, because I don't know if I can do it. And I'm not sure what the end result is going to be. What a 50-year vision gives you is it isn't actually about you and your work. It's about legacy, and it's about your highest hope, and it's about the world that you want for your children and grandchildren. And when you move to that mindset, it isn't about your to-do list. It's about what we're leaving behind in these organizations. And that picture of the future is so exciting that you want to jump out of bed every morning to make that future happen. And so I think the challenge that people often feel in sort of change and change management is they don't have a picture of what the end result is. They just know about the messy middle. Yeah. And what this gives them is a picture of what it looks like when it's fully fixed. And what we often see is that people actually feel more uncomfortable with the present state because they're excited about the future state, and they are willing to let go of long-term processes and systems. They're willing to develop new skills. They're willing to show up differently, because that future state actually feels better than the current state does. And so you're willing to do the transformation and change that it takes to get there, and let go of some of those people parts that are about worry about things being different. You're actually worried that you're going to be trapped in this pretty crappy future state, present state for a long time, and that would be really miserable if in our organizations we weren't able to create the change that we've come here to do. Who wants to do that for another 50 years? So it really gives this space to want to jump to that next phase as soon as possible.
Did you go through that process yourself? I mean, at any point as you were thinking about this work?
All the time. Yeah. I think there's a lot of work that we do that's about individuals and their impact in transformation and change that they want to create in the world. We host mastermind retreats where people take 5 days to really re-envision what's the long-term change and impact that they want to see in the world. And it was at one of those retreats about 6 years ago, I was really pushing the participants about, what do you love to do? What does the world need? And what are you really great at? And how do you just sit in that intersection? Because as you hit sort of mid-career, you get pretty good at a lot of things. And so you do a lot of things and you put a lot of things on your plate. But if you can really focus on that place where you really can be excellent and let go of all of the other pieces, that is where your real sort of legacy and impact lives. And one of the participants that happened to be one of our members of the Minnesota Council on Foundations said, I find that really interesting, Trista, because you seem to come to life when you do this futurism work and you host these retreats. Can you explain to me why you run this membership association of foundations? And I was like, well, number one, it's not about my transformation, it's about your transformation. And two, at that point, MCF had 170 foundation members. They gave away $1.5 billion a year. I helped each of those foundations develop a future frame for their work and an racial equity frame for their work as well. And so you could see this really amazing ripple effect that was happening throughout the state. And I said, you know, these are all the things that I get to do. And I get to spend about 40% of my time on futurism work, which is amazing to be able to work with these organizations. And she said, you didn't say 40% of your time, you said 100% of your time. And as soon as she said that, I was like, oh, I have to quit my job. Oh no. Like it just was the light bulb had turned on where it was very clear that the path and the impact that I wanted to make was away from a very cushy seat that I had and into uncertainty and struggle and change and all of those things. I had a daughter that was in college at that time, and she was like, could you not do this? That'd be great. If we could just keep health insurance and you keep paying this tuition, that'd be lovely. And decided to start the business at the end of 2018. I spent all of 2019 speaking at conferences and doing all this travel, was fully booked for 2020 because every foundation and nonprofit conference was 2020 Future Vision. And so they needed a philanthropic futurist to come, and was super excited about that path. And then the pandemic happened and every single one of those conferences got canceled. And suddenly I was like, maybe it was a really dumb idea to start my own thing and to do this sort of work on my own. I had the support of this big organization, and now it's just sort of me out in the wilderness, and decided right away that I was going to start to do scenario planning with nonprofits about the pandemic and what it might mean for their work. Then later being in Minneapolis when George Floyd was murdered, did a ton of pro bono work with racial equity groups to envision what the future of our city could look like and what the future of safety might look like. And that fall, suddenly, I think every foundation and nonprofit in the country realized that their strategic plan no longer worked, and also realized they needed a racial equity frame. And when I had been speaking at those conferences, the frame was how to build a more beautiful and equitable future. And they were like, Trista was talking about that, please help us. And so suddenly the business grew a ton, and we've added a team of folks that are based around the country and around the world that help with this work. And we really needed to scale in a different way. But there's always that growth piece that is about your mental jump from where you were and what's comfortable to what's next. That is absolutely terrifying. And even when you know that that's what that feeling is, it still doesn't feel great. But if you have a clear picture of the transformation and change that you want to take, then you know how to show up in those moments of uncertainty. And showing up in those moments of uncertainty means that it helps you to get closer to that future that you've laid out for yourself, which is what's happened with FutureGood.
Yeah. What does your daughter say about all this now?
I think that's a great idea. And it's been really interesting. I used to live in Minneapolis. I moved to California last year. There's a saying, California is 25 years ahead of the rest of the country. And so it felt right to move to a place that's sort of giving you a picture of what the future is going to look like. And so she came for Christmas last year with my son, and it was 85 degrees, and we were, on the beach on Christmas Day. And she's like, I feel like this was a good choice. I feel like.
And that was probably not even part of your visioning experiment.
No, that was not, but she could see how all the pieces come together.
So a couple of things struck me, even going back to the book, which I know is a few years old now, but one of them is, I just love this quote on the back, which is, I see why you put it up first among the blurbs, which is, whether you're out to cure cancer, rid the world of nuclear weapons, end racism, or solve water scarcity. I mean, talk about a prediction in a blurb.
Yes.
FutureGood is a valuable guide for how to think about and implement systemic lasting change. And that's, I should attribute that. It's Paul Carroll and the Nuclear Security Partnerships in N Square. But that's a remarkable thing, because often when people hear about something like futurism, they might think, well, how does that apply to me?
Yeah.
I've got to raise this money tomorrow. If we don't make our financial goal, we cannot serve those meals. And all of that is true. But I guess you're talking about imagining what the future looks like, which is different, right? I mean, so I guess that's one of my questions, both about the book and about this framework, and maybe how you're working with organizations, which is, how much of this is about changing what we do and how much is about changing what we think?
It's probably 50-50. So you need both of those things to be able to create change. And I think the challenge for people that do good for a living is we are so busy with the present that we have no picture of what the future looks like. And what we find working deeply with organizations is that in that organization, there's probably 200 different views of what the future is that they're working towards. So it's really hard work, but very diffused effort. And what a futurism frame brings is a singular picture of the future. And suddenly everybody's pushing in the same direction. And your work adds up to my work, and we're getting momentum, and then it encourages people to continue to push harder. And that's the real power of these tools, is that singular point on the horizon, and understanding what are the activities that we're doing in this moment that are either taking us to that future or not. There's a tool that we use with organizations called the strategy screen, where you go through a series of questions to figure out, is something aligned with the picture of the future or not. And when I was at the Minnesota Council on Foundations, one of our members reached out that had recently retired. He'd been really engaged in the organization. We were having a big annual conference, and he said, "Hey, I really miss my peers in philanthropy. Could you have a reception for people that have retired at the conference? I'd love to come." Super easy. We've got a minimum at the hotel. It's just another thing to throw together. Fantastic. So I bring it to my full staff team and I say, "Hey, really love to have this reception." And the tone was pretty much like, "Tell me what room it's going to be in." And one of the staff members said, "Could we run this through the strategy screen?" And I was like, "For my stuff?" This is for everybody else. Is it for my stuff too? And the first question was, how does this improve the philanthropic practice of current foundation staff? And it didn't. And so it wasn't that we didn't host the reception, we had to reframe it. And so what we did is we asked our retired members to come back and to talk to our McKinley Fellows, which is a fellowship program that we have to diversify philanthropy. People were very new in their roles. And those folks that were retired from the field could share what they had learned, and they could have a conversation back and forth. Everybody had an amazing time. The retired folks got what they needed about connecting with each other and being able to share what they'd learned. Our McKinley Fellows were able to increase their philanthropic practice and get smarter about the work. And so what that alignment means for you is that when you say yes to things, that yes is additive instead of just another thing on the plate that's not getting you where you were going. Because if we had hosted it without that frame, it would have been fine. It would have fit within the work that we were doing, but it wouldn't have moved us forward to the future that we were hopeful about.
Yeah. I also like it that you're talking about how to say yes as opposed to how to say no. I know we need to do both. I certainly need to do more of the latter, but it's but if you're focused on the things you want rather than the things you don't, that must just present the opportunities. Or you could see things maybe that were right in front of you that you had missed. Like a lot of retirees have a lot of talent, experience, and probably something to contribute. But if you just had a reception for them, what purpose does that serve for them or for you? So you found the thing. So that's one tool, and I know there are a number of tools here. Do you want to talk about any other tools that maybe can be in people's toolkit as they work through?
I think the most important thing is to set aside 5% of your time for the future. So a little bit of time each week. And I know folks are like, "I've got so much on my plate." Cut out this little piece of time, a couple hours a week. I like Friday afternoons because it's a little bit quieter. And during that time, set Google alerts for yourself: future of fundraising, future of philanthropy, future of early childhood, future of food shelves. And you've got a constant sort of stream of information that you can put in a folder. Those Friday afternoons, read those articles, and then keep a notebook for yourself, a paper notebook, or I like Evernote notebooks, which are an electronic notebook, because I can clip the article and then I write notes to myself. What does this mean for my organization? What does this mean for the communities that we're working with? And every week you're getting a clearer and clearer picture of what the future looks like. And you're noticing opportunities and you're noticing transformation and change that can happen through your work. You're learning what a really innovative organization in another state or another country has done to fundraise differently or to reach out to donors. There's a lot of work that's happening about using AI for donor letters and how to really systematize that process so that you are getting a clear message that lands correctly in the donors that you're trying to reach out to. Who's doing that work? What have they learned from the process? What didn't work, so that you don't bump your head in the same place? But creating that spaciousness to pay attention to what's happening in the future allows you to see those opportunities in the present. And for some of our client organizations, they want to share what they're learning across the organization. So they use Slack channels, or they use Chatter and Salesforce. They'll create a channel called Trends or Signals of the Future. They'll link those articles. The person that linked it will say, I think this means X, Y, and Z. Somebody else will read it and say, yeah, maybe, and it might also mean this. So those different perspectives looking at the same thing allow you to see opportunities that you might have missed on your own, and it helps your organization be more resilient. We are entering a time where change gets faster and more intense, and that is not going to stop. That is unfortunately the time in human history that we are living in. And so this idea of, I can't wait until after the pandemic and everything will calm down and go back to normal and it won't feel so stressful and the pace won't seem so intense. That's not a real thing. And so if we are living in a time where the pace of change is like this, it's really important to understand what's coming next, so that before that thing runs into you, you know it's a possibility, you've developed a strategy, and you've learned how to harness whatever that thing is to get you closer to success.
You mentioned AI in there in the context of using it as
Yeah.
a tool, for writing, which it certainly can be.
For sure.
But I imagine there might be ways to use AI in terms of doing things like you just mentioned with Evernote, where
Yeah.
one of the issues with any journaling, and we do a lot in our house, especially my wife, is that you can have journals that go back 20, 30, 40 years. And sometimes you have something in there. There's a kernel of something important.
Yes.
That might be also just something in the last 3 months that are in a professional journal. But synthesizing it and then turning it into something actionable sometimes is difficult, or we might not be able to see it in the clouds. I wonder if AI offers a set of tools to take some of our thought process and then, make something discernible.
Yeah, the new version of ChatGPT allows you to upload large amounts of information, PDFs, things that you couldn't do previously, and then ask it questions about that document. And so if you had a typed up journal and you uploaded it in there and said, what are the themes? What are the lessons learned? What are the 10 things that I should do next based on these 20 to 30 years of learning? It is very easy for AI tools to synthesize broad amounts of information. And with our organization, everybody on our team is responsible for figuring out how to use AI for their role. And then they share with each other. I tried this. We figured out that the tone of ChatGPT does not match our organization. It's too academic, too stuffy. And so what we did is put in a bunch of my writing and then asked what the tone was. And it's friendly and it's informative are the two main pieces. And then accessible is the other part of the work. And so anytime we ask ChatGPT to write something for us, then we ask it to write it again and use those 3 criteria. And then that is our first draft. And so we had a lot of conversations on our team where I get things that team members have written and I go, so the robot did this. That is cool. I need you to do your next version of it, because if you don't use good prompts for many of these tools, what happens is it starts to repeat itself. It starts to make up facts to fill the holes. And so a really strong prompt like, Imagine that I am the #1 individual donor fundraiser at Harvard University, and I am writing a 4-paragraph letter about this new program. Here are the attributes of this program. And the letter is going to a 65-year-old widower who is interested in youth from this community. Give me 10 options for that letter. What would that look like? That's going to give you a starting point where then you can bring the people part of it and you can refine it so that it feels like your organization, but the structure of it is so strong. And I think for many of us, it's how to structure the ideas where we get really stuck. We've got lots of ideas bouncing around our head. Dump all of those ideas into these tools and then ask it to structure something that's useful. And then it allows your brain to then move to the next step.
So you can do proper revision, and make it more human, among other things, or more like Trista. Yes. And one of the other thoughts I had about that is that this isn't just about the tech; it's also maybe a process that you apply with others. And I have 2 questions in here for you. One is I run into this a lot on the consulting side of my life, where sometimes a prospective client will come to you looking for things that they probably shouldn't be asking a consultant for. It might be, we need some donors, that kind of thing, rather than developing the relationships with people who care about the same things, are aligned with your mission and values. But anyway, they come to you for donors, or they come to you to tell you, asking you to prescribe essentially what they should do, rather than using it as a process for discovery. I'm wondering if sometimes when you've talked with people, if they've tried to have you act like a doctor writing a prescription, and how you counter that, because it's a natural tendency to say, I have an ache, can you just give me a pill? But 100%. In fact, probably it's better if you find out what the cause of the ache is. And I would imagine that's what some of these processes will allow you to do.
Yeah, so much so. And I think it is easy as a consultant to jump into that doctor prescribing mode, because I've worked in the sector since I was 15. So I've worked on the nonprofit side and the foundation side, and a lot of their challenges that they're facing, I face too. And so it's sort of, here's what you should do. And what we've had to be really thoughtful about is that our strategy and visioning process is about pulling the brilliance out of the people in the room. So the first session that we do usually has 30 to 100 people, staff, board, volunteers, community members. And in that process, they're envisioning the ideal future. And in that brainstorming process, and then there's a design thinking process afterwards where you're making meaning out of those ideas. Because those ideas are anonymous, what happens is there may be a community member that has this flash of insight that nobody in the organization ever would have access to. But once they see it, they're like, oh, that's the thing. Now, if the CEO of the organization had said that in a big room, everybody say, yes, oh, definitely, that's exactly what we're going to do. But if it is the 12-year-old that you've invited to come, then people may sort of poo-poo the idea. So when the ideas are anonymous, it allows you to really look at them from different angles and start to make meaning out of those ideas. And what I think is really interesting in the process is that as they're developing those pictures of the future, it is not about me being an expert in all those things. It is Paul's quote about folks working on cancer and nuclear arms and water and all of those things. We have clients working on every possible issue that you could think of, and I could never be an expert in all of those issues. The experts are sitting in the Zoom room or the room where we're having this meeting. It is about pulling the insight from folks that are the best position to do that, but to help them have a structure around it that gives them the space to dream and imagine something different than what they're doing today. So that's the value that we bring to them, is not here's your solution. It's bringing together the people that have always known what the solution is, but nobody's asked them what that looks like. And it comes out in the process.
Can you take us through an example? I mean, I know you'll anonymize everything, but what it's like working maybe with an individual organization that's at that point where they have to renew themselves. They have to, recommit to whatever the vision is, or maybe even recast the vision. And so that you're going to draw from, I'm sure, the board, but hopefully also some staff and maybe other people contribute.
For sure.
What does that look like when you're sitting down with them or standing up with them and trying to get them out of the boxes they put themselves in?
I think it's interesting because some of the biggest and most hard to get out of boxes are organizations that have been successful enough. So when you're successful enough, funding is coming in, you don't want to rock the boat,
Yeah.
and the world is changing quickly. And so you can sort of hold on for longer than a lot of other organizations can. But if you don't adapt and change, you're going to be the big organization that fails instead of the small organizations that fail. We had a client that was based in the Twin Cities, and they had this dream of being a statewide organization, but were really stuck on this idea of, we come to this office every day and here's the ways that we work together and here's how we build community. And I know when we develop this picture of what we want the future to look like, it really is about reaching the most marginalized kids in our community, and that includes kids in rural communities, but we can't crack that nut of how to do it. And so that picture was really clear about what success looked like, but the steps to get there were really fuzzy. And so what they decided to do is to develop a 10-year plan to become a statewide organization. So here's how we're going to build these skills and stretch and grow so that we are able to move to this place. And a couple months after they finished their visioning, the pandemic started. And when the pandemic started and all these organizations were saying, what is Zoom? And how do I do HR if people are not in the office? And what are the stop gaps that we can create during this really weird moment so that we're able to serve staff regardless of where they're based? This organization said, hey, wait, all those are the tools that we need to become a statewide organization. Let's go all in. Let's really figure it out and not do this half-hearted thing that I think a lot of organizations were, that are like, we'll try, but maybe this will be fine and we don't really have to dive in, so we're not going to invest the time and energy to really figure it out. They jumped in and figured it out and became a statewide organization in the first year of their 10-year plan, because the external conditions allowed them to get there so much faster than they ever could have anticipated when they were sitting around that table dreaming.
You were talking about this, I can't remember if it was just before we went live or after. You almost did a hockey stick motion, and
Yes,
given
yes.
where you used to live, you actually know what a hockey stick looks like, unlike most of us.
I do.
So
Yes.
this kind of idea about growth, but also investment and change,
Yeah,
you were describing it as being like almost at a 90-degree angle.
it is.
And my one of my concerns as
Yeah.
we pass from the reality we were in and through COVID and all the things that came during that time and now, is
Yeah.
that people might start to put away some of those dreams,
Yeah.
or just think, well, this is sort of like you were saying,
Yeah.
this is good enough.
Yeah.
We're also confronted with some pretty big challenges, some of which are existential, like the climate crisis.
100%.
And so where are you seeing that hockey stick?
Yeah.
And then how is that and what are the influencing factors for that, and how are you contributing to that?
Yeah. The biggest factor is technology. And so this exponential curve is really tied to Moore's law, which is a theory about computers getting faster and more powerful at a very predictable rate. So it's doubling in speed every year and a half or so, with the cost staying the same as what it's supposed to be. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but so the challenge with Moore's law is that as technology gets faster and faster, all the things that are tied to it, which is everything about human existence, also gets pulled along that curve. And so I think AI is a really great example of that, where I've been following AI for the last 15 years. There's been a lot of AI tools that I have tried, and it wasn't worth the time and energy. So the amount of time that it would take for me to put in the information and the result that I got back, I could have just done it on my own. And so I, wasn't interested. Last November, when ChatGPT came out and I tested it, I was like, oh, that's it, the end, that we have hit the point where the usefulness is so much higher than the effort that I've put into using this tool, which means everything in society is now going to be influenced by AI. And I think a lot of folks think of a tool like ChatGPT as, yeah, I'll use it to write the blog post or the donor letter, that sort of thing. It could be used for anything that you can think of. I use it when I plan vacations, and I say I'm spending 5 days in Paris and I like to eat food and here's where I'm staying. What should my itinerary look like? And then it gives options. And then I go, oh, I don't like that type of food. Can you redo it? And it'll come up with a new option. It takes me seconds compared to, hours and hours of time. And so I think as we're testing and trying these tools, we will find infinite ways to use them, which is why I've encouraged my staff, regardless of what their role is, figure out how AI can help with that. And then early in 2023, I wrote a blog post called, is ChatGPT going to take my nonprofit or foundation job? It probably is, and it's totally fine. So it will completely upend and transform the ways that you do work. And what that will allow is for you to do the things that humans can do, which is developing relationships and innovating and developing new ways to serve the communities that you care about. It will free you up for the people part of the work if we use the tool really well. And there was a lot of, when I released that, I got a lot of nervousness, and I'm afraid folks were really afraid there's going to be mass layoffs in the sector and maybe we shouldn't talk about it and it'll be fine. And I was like, transformation is good, and technology consistently creates more jobs than it dissipates. And so we don't know what those jobs are. When I went to high school, it wasn't like, I'm going to be a social media manager when I grow up. That wasn't a job. And so we don't know what these next level of jobs are. But a month or so later, one of the Futurism journals reached out and said, hey, we read that post. Could you write that same post about, is it going to take away your foresight or futurism job? And I was like, I don't want to write that post because I don't want to take my job. And so I had to dig into it and realize that much of the work that I do about predicting, ChatGPT does it way better. So my first step now is, if I'm working with a foundation that works in water, what are the 10 most important trends that will influence the future of water? What are the 10 most important trends about the future of rural communities? And as it's developing those ideas, what it's bouncing into are those things that I've been paying attention to during my 5% time for the future. Oh, I read an article about that. I want to dig deeper into this idea. I want to see what that means. I want to figure out what that means specifically for nonprofits and foundations instead of this big idea. So it's like a brainstorming partner, which has made my future trends much better and based on a lot more data than I can process myself when I'm reading and looking. And so the information is, it is better. It's also more biased. So I asked ChatGPT to give me a set of trends about the future of rural communities and how it might use AI, smart farming, a distance learning for students to ensure that it's tied to their exact learning level and can be used whether there are enough teachers or not, economic development for local communities. I asked it the same thing for inner city communities. The first two trends were about criminal justice reform and how to use AI for that. And I was like, actually, people in inner cities also want better education and they want economic development, and people in rural communities also want criminal justice reform. But based on what is in the internet about these two communities, what comes out is completely different. And you have the opportunity in many of these tools to give feedback. And so I was able to give feedback about that bias and how that showed up. Hopefully there's somebody behind the scenes that's helping to fix that as we go. But what if we don't interact with these tools? We also can't influence the quality of the results, and we're not going to be a part of what it looks like in the future.
Yeah. And as I'm thinking about this, I imagine that much of what we're talking about is programmatic, which is so important to organizations. How do we serve the people that we believe we're here to serve, but also maybe people we've been ignoring? So that's another piece. Is our mission timed to not just the present, the past, but also the future? All those things are true. But this is also true about fundraising, and not just from the tactical perspective about writing things, which it does brilliantly, but also maybe thinking about what we can do to be better at developing relationships that with a resource development focus. So you work with lots of different organizations. I know you have ideas of your own. This is where I ask you for a prescription, which is what I said a few minutes ago I wasn't going to do, but I'm doing it anyway. What are the kinds of things that you're hearing or thinking about that you think could enable the people in this room and those who listen to this later to be really more effective fundraisers, not just for the present, but for the future, because we are looking at some big trends down in terms of participation rates, retention rates, all these things.
100%.
We don't
Yeah.
really talk very, very intelligently or deeply about what's causing, what we may be causing in fundraising. So what are some of the things that you imagine might enable us to develop deeper, better relationships, not just the tools, but the techniques, the approaches that we should be taking?
Yeah, I think that donors are so hungry for stories of what that ideal future would look like. And what we've gotten really great at is telling people what's broken. And when we do that, and we say the gap is this big and the problem is this terrible, please give money today, donors feel overwhelmed and they feel like the problem is too big to address. And so they're just going to tap out and hopefully somebody else will figure it out. And I think that the switch that we have to make in the sector is to stop loving the problem. So how do we move to the place where instead of just constantly talking about how broken things are, that we have a picture of the future, and that the excitement that people have about making that future happen means that much bigger gifts come. So when you are able to tell a story of transformation, I as a donor then give a transformative gift. When you give me a story that is about maintaining the status quo and maybe helping it feel a little bit less terrible, it's going to be no gift, or it's going to be a small gift. And so what Futurism allows is for donors to also have a picture of, as a result of these gifts, what do I want to see different in the world? What's the legacy that I want to leave behind with these dollars? I think the other piece is that we've had a very small pie that we're constantly arguing about. And I hear a lot of frustration in the sector about there's so many new nonprofits starting and there's not enough resources. I think that a lot of our long-term organizations, if they can't adapt to whatever the new future is that they'd like to create, they're going to shut down. 50-year organizations, 150-year organizations, they're just going to be done because they have reached the end of their sort of usefulness in the world. And there's going to be 10 other small new organizations that are going to take that banner and move it forward. I think that's a fine thing. I don't think we need to get too sort of attached about this is a specific organization that needs to create change in the world. What we should be really interested in is what is the transformation and what are the different ways to do it. The other piece that I would love to see in the future in this idea of the bigger pie is who are the other partners to make that happen. So there are more companies that are saying, actually, we have a responsibility to the change that we want to see in the world. REI is a good example of that. Ben & Jerry's, there's many others. And those companies have a much bigger reach. A recent example was Virgin Airlines. Sir Richard Branson's had a vision for the last 15 years of alternative airline fuel, and they just took their first flight that was on leftover oil from cooking food, and it is a transformative change that, as it expands and grows, is going to have a much bigger impact on carbon emissions than a very small nonprofit working on that same issue would have. And so you may have partners that are in the for-profit sector that can exponentially move forward the change that you want to see. Lastly, I think we need to have a really clear picture of what government responsibility is. So years ago, I gave a speech in Sweden about the future of philanthropy, and somebody afterwards came up to me and said they had a very sort of philanthropic field that was very much in its infancy. And so here's all the great things we're doing, and here's what we've learned. And somebody pulled me aside in the reception. And they said, hey, do you think you would have any of these things if you had a functioning government that provided any services for its citizens? No, we wouldn't actually. That's why you don't have this robust field, because your government provides the things that our nonprofit and philanthropic sector have been trying to provide with a lot less resources. And so as a country, we have to hold our elected officials accountable to the future that we want to see. Is that future most of our resources going towards the military, or is it something different? What does it look like when we invest in the next version of the future of the United States? And how can the government be a real partner in creating the change and transformation that we want to see in our communities?
That's a big challenge to everybody, to to be bold, but also to encourage, not to encourage, to demand
Yeah.
that those in office are also bold. And that brings me to kind of a final question, which is kind of big, but how important is it to say these things out loud?
Yeah.
Whether you're an individual trying to find, their path to the place they really want to be versus spending 40% of their time on it, 100% of their time on it,
Yeah.
or whether it's the organization that has come to this fork in the road and they don't want to do what the proverbial baseball quote, which is to take it. No, instead they want to choose a road that really takes them into the future, or any of our sector as a whole, and whether they want to be bold. How important is it that they state these things publicly, not just privately in their own journal, in their own boardroom?
100%. I think that is the work of our sector, is to tell the stories of the future and to help people see what's possible and inspire them to make that future come true. And I think the challenge for many people that are innovative in their organizations, and they've got like, here's what I want to move forward. You need partners in that work. And it can't just be you, the lone voice in the corner, saying we should care about the future. What does it look like when in every staff meeting agenda, you ask them questions about the future? What would it look like if we fully met our mission? What's something that you thought would be invented by now but hasn't been invented? Why are you disappointed or excited that it hasn't? Creating the space for the future and the present is really important. And then a big piece of our work in the last year has been training other people on how to use futurism in their work. As much as I like hopping in a plane and bouncing around and telling people what I think is coming next, what's actually much more important is each of those people in the community has the best possible picture of what's next for the thing that they care about, because they're closer to it. And when you add futurism skills to that mix, and you add places where people can talk about what they're learning and compare those ideas, that's where real transformative change is. And so we created FutureGood Studio in 2021. Target Corporation made a huge commitment to Black-owned businesses that were based in Minnesota in that time. And they helped us figure out how to translate all of the work that's in the FutureGood book into a 3-month learning cohort that teaches people how to use futurism every single day to have a bigger impact in the world. And I look forward to a future where there's millions and millions of people that are using these tools and creating a more beautiful and equitable future. That's the future that I want to live in.
We definitely need more incubators for change. If people want to be a part of what you're doing there, or to learn more about it, or even get a copy of this book, how can people find out more about you and about the organization and about the, of course, that one particular thing?
Yeah, you can find us at wearefuturegood.com. We're also on all the socials under We Are FutureGood. The FutureGood book is available at any local bookstore, and some of the bigger ones as well. So really, I want to encourage folks to do the work that it takes to create that more beautiful future. It's worth the effort. And it makes your work that you're doing today even more effective as you're moving forward.
Thank you so much for all this, Trista. Really appreciate it. And it's great to see you again and hear all this inspiring stuff. We do have, of course, the link right there in the chat. Thank you for that, Jack. And I want to encourage everybody to go and take a look at that, and to take a look at the book, because I know this is a few years old, but it's going to be fresh as hell for you, and it'll be very valuable if you think about the future for your organization and your own life. Thank you, Trista. Thank you to everybody here, and we have more sessions coming up. This year is not out. It's just, we're just getting into the busiest part of it. So do join us. You're going to see a little link, a QR code at the end that'll take you to the DonorSearch site for more details on all of that, as well as a link to this recording. You're also going to get a little email telling you all about this session. So do be on the lookout for that. If you don't see it, look to your spam folder. And if you want to know more about what we're doing, but also want to play a role in determining what we do, please just send me a note and let me know. We'd love to know. Or fill out the survey. We'll follow you there. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.